This video is going to be a rather lengthy rant style video where I answer some viewer questions and comments that I've been getting on the channel. You guys tend to like when I do these. The first thing I want to start with is a very interesting email I got this morning from Francesco. He writes in basically, "Hi DT, we have the internet that has become very centralized. There are just a handful of large corporations that pretty much run the internet." And in particular, he mentions Google, Facebook, Amazon. And then he goes on to ask the question, is Linux and free and open source software in danger of becoming centralized? And when he asks this, he doesn't go into great detail as far as exactly what he means with centralization, but if we take the term as a dictionary definition, centralized, when something is said to be centralized rather than decentralized or distributed, centralization, we're talking about everybody basically doing the same thing, and there is basically a single ruling authority over something. That's centralization. And he is right. The internet has become very centralized. It's really just a handful of companies that control the internet. I mean, really, Google controls the internet and Facebook. The little parts of the internet Google doesn't own. Pretty much Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon are cleaning up the rest. But in my opinion, I don't share his opinion that Linux or that the free and open source software movements could ever become centralized the way the internet has become centralized with, all this corporate influence, because just the nature of free and open source software kind of prevents that from ever happening. We could never be controlled by any single entity. As a community, we have never come together and worked on a single project ever, because the whole point of free and open source software is you do your own thing, and we as a community, we will never all travel in the same direction because we all have different interests. We all have different things that we want to achieve. So I don't ever see Linux becoming centralized. I don't ever see free and open source software becoming centralized. Now, there is a ton of corporate influence with Linux. The Linux Foundation, let's take the Linux Foundation, for example. So Google, Facebook, Microsoft, they're all platinum members of the Linux Foundation. They have some controlling interest in the Linux Foundation. But the Linux Foundation is not Linux. The Linux Foundation doesn't control Linux, at least not the broader community at large. All they do is they pay Linus Torvalds salary basically for working on the kernel, but at the same time, they don't control Linux. Really, no one has that kind of power over Linux, not even Linus Torvalds. If for some reason one day Linus Torvalds and the good folks that work on the kernel could close source it, make it proprietary, maybe charge people to use the Linux kernel, well, every other Linux kernel before that we have, it was all available under a GPL license. We could just take those older kernels, fork them, and keep going. We could develop it ourselves as a community. That's why you can't really stop free and open source software. You can't really lock it down the way you can proprietary software. Linux is really not controlled by big corporations. I mean, if you talk about the big Linux companies, when we talk about Red Hat and SUSE and Canonical, yes, they're billion-dollar companies, but they're not anywhere in the same ballpark as far as their sphere of influence and power. And when we talk about companies like Google and Microsoft and Facebook and Apple, right, they are still small potatoes compared to those companies. And we, the Linux community, we can't agree on anything. You're never going to have everybody agree on one distro, on one desktop environment, especially one init system. I mean, that's the one that we've come the closest on. Probably 90% of the Linux distributions out there all use systemd, but you still have 10% that don't use systemd and will never use systemd. Now, for me personally, when I think of the dangers of centralization, the one that kind of scared me the most was the power and the influence of GitHub. Especially before Microsoft bought it, GitHub was really the central Git repository that everybody used. Just millions and millions of free and open source software projects, but also proprietary projects, hosting their source code on this one site. What happens if this one site failed? And by failed, I mean had a critical failure. They lost all the data unless, would all these projects have backups? Would there be clones out there that people had on their local machines? Most of them probably would. Many of them would not if the site failed. Also, what about the stuff that's not the source code? You know, the issues and the comments and things like that. You know, all that would be lost if you had everything basically in this one Git repository. So that always concerned me, that so many people used GitHub, that there weren't more alternatives out there. And thankfully, when Microsoft bought GitHub, a lot of people in the free and open source community especially don't really care for Microsoft. So they started looking for alternatives like GetLab, for instance, and GitLab has exploded in popularity, but there are a bunch of other great alternatives to GitHub and GitLab if you want to check them out. But that's one that always did bother me, is I really don't like the idea of everybody being in one place on anything. I think that's the reason so many people stay on Facebook. You're on Facebook because everybody else is on Facebook, and because you have to interact with those people. And GitHub is very social in its aspects as far as filing bug reports and opening issues and things like that. So a lot of people felt, hey, if I'm going to host my source code somewhere, everybody's on GitHub, I also need to be on GitHub. I always thought that was kind of dangerous. The next group of questions I want to address is I've been getting a lot of people here in the last month or two especially, but really since the channel started, but here lately, been getting a lot more of these kinds of questions. Hey, DT, how do I make my terminal look like yours? And there's no, other than that, there's nothing to go on. I don't know exactly what they mean. How do you make your terminal look like mine? If you're wanting the color schemes that I use, that's easy. Go to my GetLab page. My GetLab page is linked in the show description of every video I do. My GetLab page is also linked in the channel header. Just go check out my dot files. So if you want my terminal color schemes, if you use a terminal emulator that uses the X resources, my X resources is in my dot files GitLab repository. If you use Alacrity, my Alacrity config with my terminal color scheme is in that file. I also have my ST configs on my GitLab, and again with my color scheme that I use. So if it's the colors you want, it's available on my GitLab. Some of you though are, I think, wanting other stuff. So some of you are asking, how do you get these cool color effects coming up every time you open your terminal? That is with a program called Shell Color Scripts. It's in my GitLab as well. It's basically just a collection of terminal color scripts that I've collected over many years, and I put them all together, and basically every time I open a terminal, one of them runs at random. It's easy to get. Just, again, go to my GitLab and look for Shell Color Scripts. And I've also been getting people asking me about some of the effects of the shell. Like when I go to CD into a directory, say I'm going to CD into user share icons or whatever it happens to be, you know, and the path to that directory is underlined in my terminal. And people are like, man, how do you get the path to be underlined like that? And I think some people think that that is the terminal doing that. It has nothing to do with the terminal emulator you choose. It has to do with the shell you use. I'm using the fish shell right now. That's why it looks a little different than those of you that are using bash or ZSH, for instance. Before I get off this subject, I should also mention, some of you guys have asked me, hey, am I still using fish as my primary shell? Yes and no. So fish has some problems. Fish is not a POSIX compliance shell, so I cannot change my system's default shell over to fish. I have to leave that as bash. I'm on an Arch-based system. Bash is the default shell, and I've left that because if I change to fish, it does break some things. It breaks some scripts. It breaks my Uberzug image previews and my VIFM file manager, for example. You know, it breaks some of my bash scripts on the system when I change the default shell over to fish. So to get around this, I left my default shell as bash, but what I've done is, because I run tiling window managers, and I have a hotkey, of course, to open a terminal, super enter, typically. What I have set that hotkey to do now is open my terminal and then run fish. So every time I open a terminal with my key bindings, it always launches fish, but bash technically is the default shell running on the system. That's kind of how I got around that problem. The next thing I want to address is some comments I've got on a few of my recent videos. The comments go basically like this. Hey, DT, your distro reviews suck because your opinions are just wrong. So I got some people that were mad at me on the recent videos I did on Fedora 32, the Ubuntu 2004 releases, and then about a month prior to that, I did a video on Endeavor OS, their i3 edition, and I also did a React OS review about a month or two ago. And that's a lot of distro reviews for me. I don't like doing them, and I kind of quit doing them for a while. But here in the last month or two, I've done about 4, which is, again, unusual because I just don't care to do those. But I wanted to do the video on React OS and on Endeavor i3 because I thought those were interesting projects. React OS is not even a Linux operating system. It's something completely different. And a lot of you guys have been asking about that forever. So I was glad I did the React OS video. Endeavor was something I was personally interested in because I wanted to see how that project is maturing, and I especially wanted to run through the installation to see how their installer is coming along because they have this internet-based installer. The Ubuntu releases and the Fedora releases, I was less enthused doing videos on those, but they're such big distributions. So many people use the Ubuntu-based distributions. I had to take a look at the gigantic release that was Ubuntu 2004. Just people would expect that of me. And the same thing with Fedora 32. So many people use Fedora. I just have to take a look at that on the channel when they have a big release. But let's start with some of the criticisms. So a lot of people had a problem with my installation and first look video at Fedora 32 because, man, you didn't spend 6 months in it and really learn everything. All your criticisms was because you really didn't know how to do anything in Fedora. Well, first, I've used Fedora many times in the past. I have been using Linux on the desktop for about 12 years, and I've installed Fedora plenty of times on physical hardware and actually run Fedora. So just shut that noise down right now. The other thing, I don't actually call these reviews. They're not distro reviews because you're right, I should live in them in a while and to do a proper review, but I don't like proper reviews. I don't think proper reviews would actually be a proper review because if I spend a lot of time in something, I'm going to hack on it and change it. It's not going to be that distro that they just put out. You know, if I use it 6 months, it's going to be something completely different by the time I do a video 6 months later because it's going to be basically DT's OS at that point because I'm going to rip out GNOME, for example, out of Fedora 32. You know, I'm probably going to change the default terminal emulator in the shell. I'm going to have window managers on it. I'm going to be running all my custom scripts, and it's not going to be anything like that distribution that they shipped. That's the point of these installation and first looks, coming at it with a fresh pair of eyes, just sitting down for the first time and looking at it. And I think that is a benefit to the developers of those distributions because the Fedora installer that I always have a problem with, because I don't do Fedora installs that often. I take a look at the new releases of Fedora, which come around about every 9 months. And other than that, that's about the only Fedora installs I'll do. So every 9 months, I do a Fedora install. And I always have a problem with that installer when it's selecting the disk to actually install the operating system to. It's confusing. And if I'm having a problem with it, other people are going to be confused by it too. Maybe I'm just a complete idiot, but you know what? You're going to have other complete idiots trying to install your operating system too, other than me. So you might want to take that into account. So it's good that, you know, the Fedora devs have this user feedback that their installer is a little confusing. And then I get people that complained that, you know, I made the comment that DNF is slow in my video the other day. DNF was acting very slow, and they're like, man, you just don't know what you're doing with DNF because you didn't activate the fastest mirrors and you didn't increase the number of parallel downloads. You need to go in and configure DNF a little bit. Well, that's great. And you're right. I could do that. But again, that was a installation and first look, somebody that is coming to Fedora for the first time. And again, they would have no idea that that kind of stuff was even possible. They would try to use the DNF package manager and probably be put off by it immediately with how incredibly slow it is compared to things like apt and Pacman, for example. And I think some of you guys, maybe you're Fedora fanboys, and that's okay, but you don't think I'm throwing shade on Fedora because I actually think Fedora is a fantastic distribution. But again, this kind of feedback that I do on these videos, I think you guys, the fanboys, are taking it in a completely different way than, for example, developers of Fedora probably would take it. They probably appreciate that I showed them, you know, some of the issues that a first-time Fedora user might run into. And I had some of the same kinds of criticisms about the Ubuntu 2004 video. Some of the people were like, hey man, your opinions, I don't like your opinion. You say that Ubuntu, the main edition of Ubuntu, is one of the most attractive distributions you've ever seen. And you know what? I think it looks hideous. We're both right. It's opinion, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and I think some people also have a problem when I say, especially Ubuntu and Fedora. I talk about how polished and professional those two Linux distributions are compared to pretty much most other Linux distributions, and a lot of people don't like the fact that I say stuff like that because, of course, Ubuntu and Fedora are kind of corporate distributions. There's large corporations, backing those distributions, Canonical and Red Hat. And I think that's why they have that polished, professional look, because these people are trying to put out a product, to consumers, where the community distributions are not all focused on one task. They don't have a leader, especially, a CEO of a corporation that's really focusing everybody on a single target. And I think that's why the community distributions never quite match up to that spit and finish that a distribution like Ubuntu or Fedora can achieve. I imagine it's, just too many cooks in the kitchen, maybe with some of the community-based distributions. I will say I had a lot of criticisms about Endeavor's i3 edition, and the dev for Endeavor's i3 edition actually enjoyed the video. He liked some of my criticisms. My main criticisms was I didn't like a lot of the default key bindings he used in his i3 config. They were very strange. They were not what most tiling window manager users would expect some of the key bindings to be, and he seemed receptive to that. He said he was going to review some of the key bindings and take a look at that. And that's the reason I do those kind of first look kind of videos. They're not distro reviews. I didn't live in them in a year, but that's not the point of these videos. I don't think most of you guys that watch my content would care about me living in a single distribution for an entire year and then making a video on it. Would that be the only video I made for that year? Probably. So, but I guess I should just shut down my YouTube channel at that point. Another question I've been getting a lot here recently is, hey DT, are you still using Spectre WM? Yes and no. And by yes and no, meaning I don't log into the same window manager every day. I did live in Spectre WM for a couple of weeks after I made that initial video, and I really liked it. Fantastic window manager. I've got my configs for it on GetLab if you want to check it out. Here lately, though, I've been spending a lot more time in Qtile. Been back in Qtile for a little bit because Qtile had some new releases here a couple of weeks ago, and they broke my configs, and I had some issues with them. So I had to spend some time with my Qtile configs, and I've got all that squared away now. But, I spent a little while in Qtile, and I've been spending a little time in DWM here recently, too, working on my DWM build. But you guys know I have like 8 window managers on my system. I log into different ones all the time, and the reason I do that is because every time you see one of my videos, I'm in one of these different tiling window managers, and I like doing that to showcase different window managers to you guys, so I'm not in the same one all the time. And one of the things I'm most proud of as far as showcasing you guys all these different tiling window managers is I see my configs everywhere. If I go to r/Unix porn right now, start checking out some screenshots, I promise you, for sure, I'm going to see my Qtile config and my Xmonad configs, like guaranteed, because I see screenshots with my Xmobar, or I see my Qtile config with my power line like effect in the bar, and then I go to, if they share their dot files, and it's pretty much my config, which is great. I love that people are out there discovering these tiling window managers, maybe through my videos. It makes me feel proud. The last question I want to discuss briefly is, in the past month or so, I've gotten this question more than once, and it's basically, hey DT, did you just RTFM me? And the reason these people are asking me this is because, yes, I just did RTFM you. I am getting so many support questions in the channel comments or Mastodon email on my GetLab, people opening issues on my GetLab about things that have nothing to do with any of my configs. And what is my response to these people? Read the effing manual. Now, of course, I don't tell these people to really read the effing manual. I'm more polite, I just say, go read the manual, please. But you guys have to understand, for one thing, don't ask support questions in a YouTube video. especially if they're directed at me, a single person. What are the odds I have any idea about the problem you're having on your hardware, on your distro? There's almost no chance that I'm going to be able to help you anyway. You are wasting your time even writing that question. Go to a support forum for your distro or for whatever software you're running, and you are 1,000 times more likely to get a timely response and an accurate response if you just post your support question in the right place. Don't ask a single random person on YouTube a support question. Now, if I make a video on something, say I make a video on the fish shell, and you have a question about the fish shell, yeah, post it in the comments of that video. I might be able to answer your question, or the people watching the video might be able to answer your question, because most of us are there, to watch a video about the fish shell. Most of us probably have used it or are thinking about using it. We might be able to answer your question. But if I make a video about the fish shell, and then in the comments you say, hey man, I can't get Fedora 32 installed on my Lenovo ThinkPad model, whatever the heck it is, can you guys help me? That is so not the place to post that question. Like, go to the Fedora forums and post that question. And then the other thing is, when I tell people to go read the manual, I'm also really trying to help these people, because I don't know the answer to their question, and I know the answer to their question is in the wiki, for example. For example, the other day I got a issue opened up on GetLab, and I've had this happen a few times. Yeah, hey man, I'm using your Qtile config or DWM config or whatever it is, and Wi-Fi doesn't work on my laptop. Okay, that has absolutely nothing to do with Qtile or DWM or whatever window manager you're using, whatever config of mine, because window managers are not Wi-Fi managers. They just manage the windows. If you want Wi-Fi on your laptop, you got to install a Wi-Fi manager of some kind and figure out how to use it. I can't help you with that because I'm not using Wi-Fi on my production machine here. It's an Ethernet connection. I do have laptops, but I'm not using my configs typically on these laptops. These are usually test machines that I'm testing various distros on. But the point here is that people are asking me support questions in my GetLab that have absolutely nothing to do with my configs. And it's strange. Again, the likelihood that I'm going to be able to answer your question is so small because I'm just one person. I can't possibly know everything about every piece of software and about every hardware configuration that's out there. You really need to go ask in a large support forum for your distribution. So when you get a polite RTFM from me, I really am trying to help you, because you're not going to get an answer from me. I know you're not going to get an answer from me, so I'm trying to steer you in the direction to actually get an answer. So please, RTFM. Now, before I go, I want to thank a few special people. I want to thank the producers of the show. All these names you're seeing on the screen right now, these are my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. Without these guys, this rather lengthy rant video wouldn't have been possible. The show is also brought to you by all these fine ladies and gentlemen. All these names you're seeing on the screen right now, these are all my supporters over on Patreon, because this channel is sponsored by you guys, the community. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider doing so. You'll find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. All right, guys. Peace.